What's up, everybody? We have a new episode out now with Zach Bitter, professional ultramarathon runner, broke the world record for 100 miles in 2019 with a 6:47 pace for the 100 miles. I know, absolutely nuts. And so having him on the podcast today was kind of a fanboy moment for me, but it was one of the best ones we've recorded so far. So I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed recording it. I forgot to share a story with him on the podcast that of I'll tell at the very end in the outro to the podcast. But if you enjoy the podcast, please leave it a review on whatever place you listen to it on, Spotify, Apple, wherever, and then share it if you're interested. But thank you for coming to listen to this episode with Zach Bitter. Enjoy.
How's it
Great.
going? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly
Awesome.
fine. It's going good. How's yourself?
Good. Yeah. Yeah, no complaints.
Well, appreciate you coming on the podcast. Um, I've been a fan for a long time, but I just like kind of like hearing about people's origin stories. I don't know if you had a chance to like kind of go through any of the previous episodes, but that's kind of the method I go with is like kind of hearing where somebody came from and what
Cool.
led them to where they are today.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it sounds fun.
Sounds good, man. Well, like once again, thank you for coming on, but I'll give you just start with a like easy softball question of so what was I'm guessing you probably ran this morning. What was
Yeah.
the morning run like?
So I'm building up for a race in June that's on it's actually a quite a large indoor track. It's 443 meters. So I've been doing my long runs on the track this build a little earlier than I normally would because I'm testing out kind of shoes that I'm deciding
Hmm.
between on what to wear for the event itself. So I was out at the Austin High track. I think it was 2 hours and 8 minutes and 20.23 miles or something like that. So, it's a good long push on the track this morning.
Nice, nice. Do you like doing like a loop course or just like even as small as like a 400-meter track? Do you like doing that style of
Yeah,
a
I mean,
run?
I like really runnable courses. So ones where it doesn't necessarily have to be like a road or a track. I don't mind trail, but I do prefer running over like hiking and things like that. So
Hmm.
Um, when it comes to going after like really fast times, I like to really kind of control the environment as much as possible. So that's basically the only real reason to do it on the track, in my opinion, is because you're going to get
Hmm.
like a lot of predictability, a lot of control, and a really fast surface. So I think optimally though, like something that was maybe a little closer to a mile would probably be better if you could have
Hmm.
similar control as a track, but just a mile loop instead. I don't mind the short loops. It doesn't really bother me that much. And I mean, it's monotonous, but I think you just get used to sort of putting yourself in a different headspace than you would if you were out on like a beautiful trail or somewhere where you have some
Hmm.
scenery to kind of look at and you kind of use the lack of that as sort of like a reason to not have to think about certain things and sort of dial in a very consistent, almost like flow state type of mentality with it, I think. So, I think people are probably different on that. I think some people probably hate it.
Hmm.
Well, I'm sure some people
Yeah.
hate it, but
Yeah.
yeah, for whatever reason, I think I had a really good first experience with a track ultra. That might have part of it to do a part to do with it as well, where had I had like a miserable experience out there, maybe I never go back or just have this
Hmm.
like kind of, poor understanding of like what it would be like to actually appreciate that environment. So having a really good experience first time around probably really fed into just the ability to kind of wrap my head around what it was going to take to run fast on a surface like that.
Yeah. Okay. I like doing loops of any size, really. Um, the smallest loop I do is like a parking lot of a
Yeah.
where I was getting my oil change. And then it turned into like a whole repair that I didn't expect. But I was like, well, I might as well get a run in here.
Yeah, if you're
Um,
stuck, you might as well. And when I was in college, I lived in Wisconsin, so
okay.
we'd get snowstorms and stuff. And I remember a few times it was like the middle of a storm, and you could just guarantee this Walmart parking lot was going to be plowed almost immediately. So I just remember doing like loops around that parking lot.
Yeah. Where did you go to school at in Wisconsin?
University of Wisconsin Stevens Point.
Oh, okay. Awesome. My uncle worked there for a long time.
Oh,
And Stevens Point is like a football coach. So,
oh yeah, cool.
yeah. Um, well, let's let's go back a ways. I like to ask the question like what are like Zach's earliest memories of like the first things you remember doing as like a young kid?
Yeah, that's a good question. If we're going back to like first memories, it would be so I was actually born in New Ulm, Minnesota, but my family moved when I was like a year old, so I don't remember any of that.
Mhm.
And we were in Grand Island, Nebraska then. So my first memories were in Grand Island, Nebraska, with actually my best friend to this date. His name is Sean, and us just like playing in the backyard. I don't remember what we were playing, probably like Nerf guns or something like that.
Nice.
Something what kids would be doing in the backyard back in the, late 1980s, early
Hmm.
1990s.
Okay. Yeah. And then what did you get into back then? So Nerf guns and you and your friend Sean, would you just like roam or what did childhood look like for you back then?
Yeah, I mean, we were doing all sorts of stuff that were outdoor based for the most part. I think like, building forts, just if it was snow, if it was winter, like building like snow stuff, like snowball fights,
Hmm.
sledding, things like that. We were outside basically all the time. It was pretty rare we'd be inside, maybe for a little bit here and there, like playing a video game or something like that. But back then there was very little, there was no internet, so you had to
Hmm.
entertain yourself. So a lot of bike riding type activities too. That was something that I did a lot of just as a kid in general. Yeah, yeah, just hanging out. Eventually, when I got a little older, I started fishing a lot, so that I'd be outside doing that a lot in the summer and on weekends and things. So yeah, but pretty much anything you could imagine kids doing in the outdoors, like as a
Yeah.
in that time frame, is what we were kind of up to.
Nice. So did you grow up all of your like formative years in Nebraska or where'd you
No, my family moved to Wisconsin when I was going into third grade. So I think I was like 8. So we
Okay.
were we were then in Baraboo, Wisconsin, which if you're familiar with the state, that's kind of like really close to Wisconsin Dells, maybe like 15, 20 minutes outside of
Okay.
Wisconsin Dells, and then maybe 40, 45 minutes from Madison.
Okay. Yeah, I used to live in Columbus, Ohio, and I'm
Okay.
from Fargo, and I live in Fargo, North Dakota now, and I would drive back and forth, so semi-familiar with the area. But
Yeah.
it's a pretty area.
Yeah, you
Not
get the
as
bluffs around there, which is
yeah,
really
not
fun.
as pretty as like Arizona and down south. Is that where you live at now, or
My
where are you
wife and I
from
were in
now?
Arizona for 4 years. Now we're in Austin,
Okay.
Texas. But yeah,
Oh,
I
nice.
spent some time in Arizona. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's hard to beat running in Arizona.
Yeah. A little bit more terrain around there too.
No doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got access to everything.
Um, well, so after you moved to Wisconsin, like eight to I think eight to when you graduate high school are like some of the most formative years for people. Um, what did school look like for you? What did sports look like for you then?
Yeah, so when we were in Baraboo, we were there until I finished 8th grade. Then my family moved to Manitowoc, Wisconsin, which is right on Lake Michigan between Green Bay and Milwaukee.
Mhm.
And so there's kind of like, those are like kind of two different phases, I guess you could say, where kind of my middle school years was, spent a lot of that. That was probably my introduction to sports. By the time I want to say if I remember correctly, we started getting organized sports around 5th grade. And I don't know what we did in third and fourth for that. I think oh, you know what? I think we had like summer little league baseball and maybe
Mhm.
soccer or something like that, but there wasn't like the school based organized until you got until fifth. So it was still a lot of kind of outdoor type of activities up until then. But once I got into 5th grade, my parents were really open about doing sports. It was just like their expectation was like, you better be doing something, but you can kind of pick what it is. So I did basically all of it. I did football, basketball, baseball, soccer. Uh, I never did hockey. Hockey wasn't as popular within the groups that I hung out with, I guess, although like there is a decent hockey scene in Wisconsin. But yeah, I mean, a lot of that stuff, I was always doing some sort of sport. So usually it would be, whatever sport we were in season wise, would what my friends and I would kind of gravitate towards. So at recess, we'd be playing that, and then after school practice and stuff like that. So we kind of just cycled through a lot of those traditional ones. Um, I also got a paper route when I was in fifth grade. So that had me getting up really early in the morning, getting on my bike and delivering papers for about an hour every morning, and then maybe 2 hours on Saturday. So that sort of added a little bit of structure and responsibility, and then, more outdoor time on the bike, I guess. So that was kind of the middle school years. Then when
Yeah.
we moved to Manitowoc, got into high school, that was a bit of a transition because done I had done everything, including track and field and stuff, and even some cross country races that my dad would let me sign up for in the summer. Nothing like super organized, just like, oh, there's a meet of like 100, kids. We're gonna run like a mile and a half around some park and then call it a cross country meet essentially. So I
Hmm.
had some experience though, and I kind of knew that distance or the longer stuff in track and field were stuff I was a little bit better at, but I was also new, didn't really know what to expect, really didn't know what I cared about more than anything, more than others when it came up for sports. So in my freshman year, I actually just went out for football, and that was a good way to meet some of my eventual friends and classmates, but not
Hmm.
exactly my forte in terms of sports that I was going to excel at. So that spring, when I did track, I was doing like the 1600 and the 3200 meter mostly, and that kind of got me excited about running distance again. And then I went out for cross country that following year, and basically it was cross country and track as a main focus for the majority of high school. I did play basketball one year in the sophomore, but basically rode the bench the entire time. So that was just like practice scrimmage was my my
Hmm.
experience for that. But the running stuff went quite well. That really grew on me over the course of my high school experience. I didn't take it super seriously, other than just like kind of doing what the coach told me to do from workouts and standpoint. I didn't really train year round or anything like that until the summer before my senior year, because it was kind of put on our radar that we had a shot at making state as a team, and I had a shot at making it as an individual. So I had a little bit more incentive, I think, to dial things in a little bit more than typical. But even then, I wasn't really doing much more than say like at peak 30 miles per week training. So when
Hmm.
I graduated high school and transitioned into college track and cross country, it was a little bit of an eye opener because a lot of my teammates did quite a bit more training than I did in high school. So I was playing a little bit of catch up, I think, with just kind of the structure of the training program versus what I had been exposed to. And um, yeah, so yeah, that was kind of the high school sports experience anyway.
What was or let me re-ask this. So it sounds like up until high school, about in organized sports, you were always moving. Whether it was like outdoor activities, paper route. It sounds like there's a lot of things in your life that like kind of led to you having like a aerobic base of some sort, like that low heart rate movement
Hmm.
that you don't think about at all as a child. Do you think any of that like played into like being good at endurance?
Yeah. Yeah. When I look back at it with like hindsight, my thought is that it was probably good, given kind of how things ended up playing out, that I didn't get overly invested in any one sport.
Hmm.
Even running, and you can always go back and think like, oh yeah, I wonder what would happen if I would have gotten serious about running in middle school and really serious in high school and even more serious in college. Would I be even better, more specialized? And I don't think that would be the case. I think if anything, I
Hmm.
probably would be done with running by now if that had been the case. So I think it was probably really advantageous just for my development and sort of eventual lead into ultra marathon to have exposure to a ton of movement, but in a variety of different
Hmm.
planes and types. So, things from I didn't even mention this, but some winter sports like cross country skiing and some ice skating and things like that my family would
Hmm.
do. We had an ice pond, or not a pond. They had like this field that was dug out that they would fill with water every winter, and you could ice skate on it. Um, Stuff like that. It was just like it was a lot of movement, a lot of just probably physical development in a variety of different ways that uh, probably got my body prepared to be able to handle some of the rigors of like high mileage endurance training without maybe some of the injuries or mental fatigue and burnout that you can get if you start taking things a little bit too seriously early on.
Hmm. I think something like I've heard a lot of people talk about it that like a paper route is like you have to do it
Hmm.
every single day, and it just like hour or you set up to 2 hours on Saturdays. You just have to do it.
Yeah.
Builds a lot of discipline. It sounds like.
Yeah, it was. And I mean, it's funny because like took it seriously to the degree where like if I had someone call in and say, "Oh, we didn't get our paper," that would be like an alarming scenario for me.
Hmm.
So it was it was odd. It was almost like I took it more seriously than academic stuff in at that age. So I'm not sure what it was about that kind of spurred that sort of energy in me because I had that
Hmm.
same sort of disposition in college where once I got to college, I started taking like class and education super seriously. And I'm not sure if it was something because there was a financial element tied to it where like the paper route I was getting like a direct like payment for doing it right. And
Hmm.
we were actually rewarded too. I think we got paid, this is going to sound funny, but I think I got paid like 5 cents per paper. And then if I did a month without missing any houses, I would get a 6 cents per paper bonus. So by having a perfect month, it would bump you up 20% or whatever of what you would normally get. So that was kind of the motivator. It was direct enough and clearly in front of me, an achievable enough goal versus just like, when you're 10 years old and someone says, "Hey, what do you want to do the rest of your life?" Or you should take this seriously because in college you're going to want to know this. You don't care. Like, but then once I got into college and I'm, paying that bill for the semester tuition and all that stuff, I think then it starts to become a little more real. So, um, I definitely had that mindset in me where like, if there was a clear
Hmm.
like
Totally.
yeah, a clear like endpoint that I could be working towards. I could really dial in and take things real seriously and work really hard for it. So I think that the paper route was maybe one of the first experience I had that had that level of structure behind it.
Nice. Sorry, I'm gonna check my internet connection quick. There we go. I was getting feedback on mine. So you go to university. What were going into college? What was your expectations for college, and what did that look like to you?
Yeah, so I went to college to become a teacher. So initially that was to get a history and broadfield social studies certification, so I could kind of teach all the different history courses, psychology, geography, um, poli sci, all that sort of stuff. And I eventually ended up going back and also getting my special education license. So I was like dual certified for special and regular education. But that was kind of the primary aspect of it. The running side of things was, I definitely had a transition between high school and college, where after high school, in my mind, my running career was over. Like that was it. It was like, okay, that's where that ends. And I didn't really do a whole lot of structured running for about a year after high school. And I shouldn't say that. I did do some stuff, but it was like it wasn't with any sort of like purpose to be like this is going to be an activity I continue for the rest of my life. It was kind of more like,
Hmm.
oh, there's this duathlon and you can ride 4 miles, or I'm sorry, run 4 miles, ride 20, and then run four. It's like, oh, cool, I'll do that. And, there's some loose training towards that, but nothing super structured. But my first year in college that I went out for track and cross country, I remember like just getting like this display of just seriousness and excitement. It wasn't just like, oh wow, these guys all take this super seriously. It was like these guys really are interested in this and take it seriously.
Hmm.
And I think that kind of triggered a little bit of excitement in me to kind of figure out more about the sport and just understand like, what are we doing this for and why is this workout work and what happens if I spend a season building mileage up to like higher amounts than I would have done before. So, um, I remember my cross country coach actually told me when I first met with him just kind of the structure of things. And one thing he had mentioned is like the incoming freshmen are usually running like 50 miles per week. Sophomores, maybe 60. Juniors and seniors are going to get up to 70, 80. And then some of them even maybe 90 to 100 miles per week training in the summer. And I remember just thinking, like, man, that is a ton of running. And at one point, it crossed my mind, I was like, I don't know if I'll ever run 100 miles in a week. And it's like, you can kind of see my exposure to the sport was very kind of local And then
Hmm.
it kind of escalated a little bit in college and became a little more regional. Um, I wasn't a great college cross country and track runner. Our team was really good. Our team was like national caliber for a Division III school. So I had a lot of fast, talented teammates. But I would be like, I'd get on the varsity squad, and then in track and cross country, I'd make the conference meet and be able to run like the 10K or something like that. But I wasn't going to be like
Hmm.
standing on any podiums or winning national championships or becoming an All American or anything like that. So it was really an opportunity for me to really learn about the sport without probably taking it as seriously as maybe some of my teammates who were, scoring points in cross country at nationals or something like that would have to take it. And I think that also allowed me to kind of grow within the sport a little bit so that when I finished college, I was excited about it and I had individualized it enough at that point because since I wasn't necessarily competing to the same level as some of my teammates, it became a lot more important, I think, for me to look at it through the lens of, okay, this is something where my 5K time is this. What do I got to do to get it to that? Or my 10K time is
Hmm.
this. What happens if I do another season? Can I get it to that? And you start getting a little more creative about what your goals are outside of like the clear ones in front of you. If you're racing for national championships and things like that. So that's where I really got hooked on the sport. And through college, I was still taking my academics really seriously and thinking that was going to be my career. But what I learned along with that was that running was going to be something that I was going to invest my free time in. So
Hmm.
when I graduated college and started teaching, running was just something I was going to do. I'd wake up at 4:30 in the morning to go for a 2 hour run often during the school year. And, um, in the summer, I would live a little more like a professional athlete because I'd have 3 months where I didn't have to really do anything uh, too structured. So I could kind of train that way. And, that's kind of when I started getting into ultra marathons was around that time.
So that'd been like right after you graduated college, you started getting into ultras.
Yeah, so I graduated with my undergrad and then I did my student teaching.
Hmm.
And once I started doing my student teaching, I graduated mid-year with that. So I didn't really have a lot of prospects for jobs in the middle of the school year, especially with a social studies degree. That's not like
Hmm.
that's like not like a need position per se. So you're more looking at a scenario that it's like, okay, I'm going to put in this application with a couple hundred other people like during the summer when they're actually hiring. So I did like a lot of long-term subbing for the second half of that year between finishing student teaching, graduating, and kind of getting into the application pool the following year. And that's where I actually got some exposure to some of the special ed rooms and
Hmm.
decided, I actually really like this side of education because it was a lot more like individualized, where you're working with small groups and individuals versus like having like a big group of people come in for 45, 60 minutes and then they're out and you don't see them again to the next day. And then another group comes in and you're just kind of like managing these like, 100+ students every day. So I started gravitating towards that. And then I actually went back to school formally full time to get the special education license added to my teaching certifications. And that was the school year where I did my first ultra marathon. I did it in the fall while I was back in school again, this time at UW Oshkosh, because they had a really good department for special education teaching there. So I chose to go there to kind of get that side of the certification. And yeah, I did a 50 miler in the fall. It was the event doesn't exist anymore. It was called the North Face Midwest Endurance Championship, which was one of a series of events that culminated in a national championship 50-mile race in San Francisco. And I won it. So it was kind of a little bit of a new experience for me because I was a good runner, and up until that point, like after college, I'd won some like small local 5Ks and 10Ks and that sort of
Hmm.
thing, but nothing big. So going into something that I had really little, well, no experience in and no real like knowledge of what was going to happen when I'd start getting, I think the longest training run I did going into that race was like 30 miles. So having this like unknown of 20 miles in terms of like, I'm thinking like, I think I'm fast enough to do this well, but who knows what could happen in that
Yeah.
time frame. But yeah, so I ended up winning it and really kind of getting interested in that side of the sport. I didn't do another one for a full year after that, but then that next year when I did that event again, I got really hooked and just went all in on ultra marathon running and did like 350 milers in 9 weeks, and that sort of
Nice.
like catapulted me into just doing that as my focus for running. But I was still teaching at the time. Um, that would have been 2012 when I started running ultra marathons year round, and then I taught for I think 3 more years after that, before kind of stepping away from teaching and diving into more training and racing and coaching and that sort of thing.
So did you, I'm gonna back up a little bit, I think
Yeah.
here. Did you only teach special ed or did you also teach social science as well?
Yeah, so I actually, of the brief period of time I was in teaching, I basically, if you include some long-term subbing positions, is about 5 years. So I mean, I did everything from one quarter I had a group of AP psychology, like four classes of that. So like, pretty higher level high school uh, psychology, and then one unit of IB European history. So that was kind of like my first real responsibility, where there wasn't someone standing over my shoulder watching to make sure
Mm,
I was, doing okay and everything like that. And then I went back that then I went back to get my special ed license. So there's a year of no teaching other than some practicums that you would do during the school year. And once I finished that license, technically I was supposed to student teach again, but since special education departments are oftentimes looking for employment,
mhm,
you could find a job and then student teach on the job. So I ended up getting a job doing seventh grade special education up in Marinette, Wisconsin, and I did that for 2 years full time. And that was kind of an interesting transition because like the education system in Wisconsin at the time, they were sort of moving away from what they would call like pull-out type scenarios where you would separate the special education students, the students with special education, um, and then like the regular ed classrooms. They were trying to like reintegrate. So it would be like, okay, we want to, rather than having a special ed teacher and a small group of kids out in this room and the regular ed teacher and those kids in another room, let's bring the teacher and the students into the regular classroom and have them sort of support those students with their needs and whatever it is that they're working on, to help the regular ed teacher modify the tasks and the stuff that they were working on. And so I was doing a lot of that for 2 years
mhm.
for seventh grade before um, I ended up taking a job in Middleton, Wisconsin, which is just outside of Madison, for my last 2 years of teaching at a high school. And they were part of the public school district. Middleton Cross Plains is a really big school district. I think their high school is like maybe 2,000 students or something like that.
Mhm.
But they had this alternative school that they sort of repurposed the year prior that I got there. That was They turned it into like a project-based school where it was part of the public school district, but they also had a charter license. So they had like a board and a bunch of like different ways to like raise funds and things like that. And that specific school was maybe about 100 students, and it was ninth through 12th grade. The way we structured things was just a lot different than your typical classroom structure, where we would focus on what we called seminars, and the students would like submit topics they were interested in. So we'd build these seminars around those topics, and then we just embed like all the core curriculum type subjects into those topics. And it was a lot more hands-on, a lot more project-based type of a setup there. So I did that for 2 years before ending my teaching career for the time being.
Nice. I I'm in the education world as well. I was an education undergrad and got my master's in education.
Oh,
Now I'm
okay, cool. So
back
you
in
teaching or?
no, so now I'm back as a PhD student in education for
Oh,
adult
right on.
learning. And so I'm always fascinated to hear why people get into teaching and
Yeah.
like the Appleton story is interesting as well because we have not a new school, but a school just north of Fargo here that switched to a project-based style of learning as well.
Hmm.
And it's interesting to hear about that. And I'm in the ag ed world, so like ag education, FFA, stuff like that.
Hmm.
Um, and we do like a lot of projects in our classes, but it's interesting to see it go for like the whole school as well. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was they were on year two when I started there, so there was a lot of collaboration amongst the teachers too, to sort of kind of like unlearn a little bit, because we were all
Hmm.
formerly regular, teachers in the typical structure. So some of it's like, all right, if we're going to make a model that's different enough to make it useful to actually have, we have to be aware of our own biases as like,
Hmm.
what a typical educator would do, and then start to kind of relearn how to build a learning environment that kind of matches what we were trying to get at there. So the first year there was still quite a bit of learning going on amongst just our staff and everything to kind of get dialed in and just, create relationships that we could collaborate, because the teaching staff wasn't huge, so we'd have like one certified math teacher in the building, but 100 students. So like they couldn't be helping every student in math all the time. So that meant like, okay, well, what other teachers interested enough in math that they can help the math certified teacher when they need that and run some like smaller like pull out type work for students that needed to work on some math skills and things like that. So it was really interesting just to be able to kind of be certified in specific areas, but
Hmm.
also be very much involved in like all the subject areas. And it really was like this shift in mentality of I'm not the expert here in the content. I'm the expert
Hmm.
here in how to acquire knowledge about the topic that we're diving into. So that was actually kind of refreshing to me because with my first experience being AP psychology and IB European history, it was like I was a day smarter than the kids. And if the kid had
Yep.
done any sort of interest in the topic we were going to
Yeah.
cover, I probably wasn't a day smarter than them. So
Yeah.
it was one of those things where you kind of have that like that little bit of angst of like, okay, I got to make sure that I know I don't want to get caught off guard. I don't want to, not know what I'm doing and look kind of foolish in front of the class to this mindset of like, oh, I'm not expected to know. I'm expected to know how to learn. So when
Hmm.
some kid comes to me with an interest in a topic they probably do know way more than me because they're the one who's interested in it, I just need to teach them how to learn and how to where the math is in here, where's the reading in here, where's the writing in here, how do we kind of make all that stuff combine. And that was just such a great experience to kind of learn in terms of just like reshaping my mind and my expectations around just like the idea of education in the first place.
Cool. That's fascinating. Um, I think a lot of kids would benefit from having that type of experience.
Yeah.
Um, it gives them a lot more autonomy over like what they're doing. That's
Yeah.
cool.
hmm
So you kind of get started into the ultra universe after coming out of college. Did you start increasing your mileage at this point to like have a lot bigger weeks?
Yeah, so my college coach was definitely like a higher mileage like philosophy. So I bought in immediately with that and started kind of that process in college actually. And I worked up to where the summer before my last year, I think I was running close to 90 miles per week. And then during like spring break, my senior year, I think I ran 100 miles or something like that for the first time in my life in a week. So I was sort of already trending that direction. And then when I got done with like the structure of college and started doing the teaching stuff, I was actually like more fatigued from speed work. So I just ran a bunch of
Mhm.
miles. So that I think once I started training on my own, I was running 100-mile weeks pretty consistently from there on in. Um, and it wasn't until I probably got like a little bit more removed from the college racing scene to start kind of putting a little more structure around workouts in again.
Nice. What did your body respond like to all that?
My body has always responded I wouldn't say better, but maybe more directly to volume. So
Hmm.
the way I describe like endurance adaptations is people usually, or sometimes people will think like, well, this one workout is going to do this one thing. So if I want that one thing, I have to do that workout. The reality is doing more is going to probably improve you across the entire aerobic intensity spectrum. So if you just do a ton of slow miles and increase volume, you're going to get better at the top end of that spectrum too. It's just not quite as direct. So, like,
Hmm.
if you want to peak for something that is higher up on that intensity spectrum, then you probably want to start doing some work towards it. So, for me, like, if I want to try to get like just generally good at running, doing a lot of mileage tends to work really well. And I tend to be able to tolerate quite a bit of that. My body responds well to it. I don't usually get injured from lower intensity stuff. Um, and it's more of the speed work that I have to be a little more careful about in terms of doing too much of, or I start feeling flat or pick up an injury or something like that.
Hmm.
So, um, but there's a balance there too. I think like the one cool thing about endurance running, the easy way to maybe say it is like whatever the best workout for you is right now is probably the one you haven't been doing. So
Yeah.
you do kind of cycle through the different phases of like, okay, I'm going to do some short intervals kind of near the top end of the aerobic intensity spectrum, or I'm going to do some long intervals like near my lactate threshold, or different types of like training stimulus that are going to kind of nudge things along. And that's where the fun is, I think, for me, is the kind of the planning of that side of it.
Okay. And then when you left college, were you still being, did you coach yourself or did you, how did that look for you?
Yeah. Yeah, I was completely self-coached at that point, and yeah, I mean even into the ultra running stuff, there was a lot of kind of learning by doing, and at
Hmm.
that time the sport was just starting to experience a shift up in growth, and there was still a lot of kind of like anecdotal type recommendations where you would just talk to other ultra runners and be like, well, I did this and it worked well. It's like, okay, well,
Yeah.
maybe I'll try that. We've
Yeah.
gotten there's still a lot of unknowns within the world of ultra running in terms of what's optimal, but we've gotten a lot more refined in terms of kind of what kind of recommendations are maybe a little more reliable than others.
Mhm. I think the body types in ultra running as well. I think like your top end of the spectrum is still like the smaller frame and like
Hmm.
what you think the I would say that the elite runner looks like. But you also have a ton of others who are doing it as well that are getting like pretty fast as well. And I look
Yeah.
at like, um, is he elite? No, but like Truett Haynes,
Yeah.
like he's still
He's
a
pretty
big
quick.
guy
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and you can see how jacked he is, but he still moves really fast. Um, and so I think it's interesting to see how the different body types handle it and whatnot. Um,
Yeah, and there's a durability component too,
mhm,
especially when you get out into the mountain type stuff. Well, where like I think you look at some, if even you look at like Giannis Kouros, who is like one of the more recognizable flat ultra marathoners historically. He was, I mean, he's not a big person, but he does not look like what you would see on the Olympic starting line of the marathon.
mhm,
He's got a little more muscle tone to him, or a little more like a little more weight to him. So it's like I think when you start getting into these really long ultras, to some degree, especially the multi-day stuff, I think like durability and just not breaking down becomes
mhm.
quite a bit of quite a quite important when we're not kind of working at the top end of the aerobic spectrum in racing and things like that. So it gets interesting for sure.
Okay. What, what, this is kind of going back to your beginning ultra days now. When you were starting to see success in the ultra verse, what did your mindset look like at that point?
Yeah, it was interesting because I did ultras for about 2 years at like a high enough level where I felt like I was competitive at least regionally. And then like, if I got into like a bigger race. Like I got into the Western States 100 as my first 100 miler, and I think I was like 14th there. And Western States is like the most competitive 100 miler in the United States. So like top 10 is like a big target there. So I sort of was like, okay, well, that's my first 100 miler. I'm pretty new to this. If I spend some time working, I could start carving into that. And that was kind of my idea there. But then I ended up doing a race at the end of 2013 called the Desert Solstice Track Invitational, which was my first track ultra. And there I broke the world record for 12 hours and the American record for 100 miles. So I started to kind of connect the dots of just like, oh, you know what? If I'm going to be training on the relatively flat roads of Wisconsin, it may
Hmm.
be better for me to race in environments that are flat versus trying to go out and run mountain races. So
Yeah.
that kind of highlighted that side of the sport to me a little bit, and the idea of like specificity with your training and where you maybe would need to be exposed to different things a little bit more readily if you want to improve upon them. And that race though in particular is probably what kind of pushed me a little bit more up onto like the national and global scale of racing. And then from there I got on three 100K world championship teams for Team USA, and went on to re-break my American record in the 100 mile. And then I actually did dabble in the trails quite a bit during that time as well. But by 2019, I broke the world record and 100 mile in 12 hour in one event. So like, 2013 though was probably where I started thinking, okay, there might be some sort of career here versus just purely a hobby.
Hmm.
And that's where I started getting some support from brands that were at the very least willing to kind of pay for just the ins and outs of getting from races and things like that, and all the like the gear and necessities that are required to train optimally and that sort of thing. Yeah, and then in 2015 is where I got to a point where I started getting enough support from sponsors, and my coaching business actually started to kind of organically grow. Just people like reaching out saying, "Hey, I saw that you ran that race. That was really cool. Do you coach? Can you coach me?" And then
Mhm.
I ended up my last year of teaching, I ended up with like I think 15 coaching clients that I was kind of managing in my free time, which with the running and the teaching was getting pretty full. So
Mhm.
I was kind of at a crossroads at the end of that school year where it's like I need to probably focus on one or the other here because otherwise I'm going to be suboptimal of what I'm capable of at all this stuff, and I
Mhm.
don't want to be like making compromises as a teacher and as a runner and as a coach versus really being able to do my best at one of them or two of them in this case. And really I was really on the fence about it. I was actually gonna teach for another year. I was leaning towards like, okay, I think maybe one more year teaching, and then I was kind of kicking the ball down the road a little bit, just thinking, okay, I'll teach for one more year and then make a decision. But I had a co-teacher who just basically said like, what are you doing, man? Like this isn't going to be something that you have forever. Like running
Mhm.
professionally is a very tight window. And he's like, you could teach well into your 60s and 70s probably if you wanted to. This will be here if it doesn't work out or if you decide you want to come back. So that was maybe the little bit of like encouragement that I needed. Just like, yeah, you know what? Bet on yourself while the opportunity's here. See what happens. You can always come back to teaching. The principal that I worked with at the time was great, and she was just like, hey, go chase it. If it doesn't work out, you're always welcome back. So that was like I had a pretty kind of comfortable exit with that in terms of
Mhm.
how that went. And I mean, from there though, what it really did was, I mean, I had a 3-year contract, so I sort of had a little bit of security there in terms of, all right, I've got at least 3 years to try to see if this works. But I was kind of looking at it as one year at a time, just because I didn't necessarily want to have an unfulfilling lifestyle if I ended up not liking it. And I did know from my experience teaching that doing nothing but training and racing was just not the lifestyle I was looking for. I needed something else. So, like every summer I would love summer when it would start and it would feel refreshing to kind of have the break and I could just focus on training and stuff like that. But then by the time it'd get to be August, I'd start getting antsy and it's like, okay, I need to be doing something other than just this. And that was a really good experience for me because then when I kind of transitioned away from teaching, I knew like, okay, I have to have other things that I'm focusing on and doing outside of just the training and racing, or this is going to get kind of stale or too one dimensional. So I've always sort of been kind of interested in just like, helping sponsors that I was working with for marketing initiatives and things like that, or building out my coaching business, building out a podcast, and really getting into like some other elements of the running world and keeping myself a little bit more busy than what I would if I was just kind of eating, sleeping, and running all the time.
So there's a lot to unpack there. I'm curious about the mindset and what you told yourself when you're like, okay, I'm going not all in because you said you did some other things as well. But when you're like, okay, I'm done teaching, let's dive into basically being a professional athlete. What did that mindset or what did that look like in your mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I embraced it entirely. I moved out to California. So I like went from it wasn't even just like, all right, I'm just gonna kind of keep everything else the same and just do this and not teach. It was, pack everything up, move out west. And that mindset I think came from just being out there a couple times during the summer while I was teaching and thinking like this would be a great place to train. So I also had some opportunities out there too because they're like in terms of like working with brands, being out west is where a lot of these brands kind of really build themselves out. So it was just I had way more opportunities being out in California than I did in Wisconsin outside of the training and racing. Well, and even with the training and
Hmm.
racing, I had access to like real mountains and things if I wanted to do something that was more trail based too.
Yeah.
So it was sort of a like, you know, let's go all in on this in the sense that I'm going to change everything and just try to optimize this type of lifestyle as much as possible and really just dive in and see what happens, see if I like it instead of just trying to phase in parts of it and determine if like some of it I liked and others I didn't. And It's one of those things where like when I look back about some of those decisions now that I'm older, I'm just like, I was way more comfortable than I should have been about that. It's like one of those things where when you're younger, I think you're just more likely to take risks sometimes. Well, I
Hmm.
mean, you're not losing as much either because you haven't built anything really yet at that point. I mean, I hadn't built anything other than the teaching certifications and the education and then kind of finding a really good teaching spot for me. So I had definitely built that. But in terms of like building something on my own, I wasn't really gonna lose a lot if I had failed. So I was very like open to failure if that happened to be the case. And I just started kind of focusing on, okay, I want to build a coaching business. I want to build a race resume. I want to like really learn the ultra running world and what it takes to be a good ultra runner. I want to be part of the learning process as the sport gets more popular and we need more research and more information as to what's going to work and what's not going to work in some of these events. And yeah, I mean, that was kind of my mindset going into all this is like I tried to like apply the education side of my expertise from being a teacher into the world of ultra marathon with working with other people, myself, and just learning the sport and helping it grow to some degree.
So what did that look like? That because from the outside view in to like I've been following you for a long time, but what did that look like to you? Like what were the things that you wanted to focus on to do that?
Yeah, I really got into kind of the nutrition side of things. Just figuring out like, well, what's the best way for me to fuel
Hmm.
for this event. And I mean, to some degree, that's something you have to do, regardless of what your nutrition looks like. It's a component on race day that if you don't have a good system set up, it's going to cost you. So, where the variables shift in running races is when you get to races where fueling becomes a necessity, and then it shifts even further when it becomes like something where like a little mistake or there's like even a marathon, there's not a tremendous amount of fueling in a marathon relative to an ultra
Hmm.
marathon. So like you can do a lot without too much risk because you get to the finish line before the disaster happens. Whereas with ultra marathoning, if you make a mistake fueling wise, it can cost you the race. It can go from being a great day to a terrible day really, really fast. So I got really interested in kind of that logistical side of it and everything that kind of goes into that and also the training side too. My philosophy as a coach and an athlete has shifted and evolved as I've learned more about the demands that are required and how to get yourself optimally prepared for those things. So um, there's just been a lot of learning, a lot of trial and error, and then also a lot of like, looking at what we actually know and applying it and seeing how it works for me at the individual level. And then also with other coaching clients as they kind of run into the same experiences.
Do you have any the most I've learned from like the ultras I've done has been the big errors, the big failures.
Yeah.
Do you have any like big failure stories that like you're like I'm gonna try this and see how it goes, and do you have any stories like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I've definitely had some where it was just like most of my big failures have sort of come in the realm of, all right, I'm going to go after a record here, and it just didn't work out, and I ended up dropping
Hmm.
out. I haven't had a lot of failures in the terms of like, oh, okay, that was just a massive like digestive mistake. I've had some that were uh, where that was problematic, but the bigger ones were just like going after the ones that stand out to me anyway were ones where it was like, okay, I set out to try to break the 100-mile world record that day and things fell apart and I dropped out at 60 miles or something like
Hmm.
that. Um, and that was even some successful races too. Like in 2015 when I rebroke the American record for 100 miles, I was on pace for the world record all the way. I was ahead of it at 80 miles. And then I needed to maintain, I think like something around a seven flat or a little right around a seven flat. And I just started like creeping up to 7.5 and I just could not get moving faster than that. So I saw that world record kind of slip away. And so even though it was my fastest 100 at the time, it was also kind of like, oh man, I was like so close to really nailing that race. And That type of that scenario specifically was that really caught my attention, I think, in terms of like I need to get back to that spot where I'm feeling like I'm executing this race really well at 80 miles, but instead of having it fade, have it, progress.
Hmm.
So I spent a lot of time thinking about that over the years after that particular event.
So what's your mindset look like to dissect those points of where you're trying to learn from yourself? And um, if you had a similar education experience to I did, we learned through reflection, um, and analyzing how something went and what can go better.
Yeah.
Um,
hmm
what
I
does
mean,
that look like for you?
that's one thing I like about the track ultras is there's a lot less guesswork when it comes to what went wrong because you have a lot more data and it's a lot more consistent where it can be very difficult on like a mountain race where let's say like your quads blow up and you're like, oh, why were my legs so sore at mile 80 to the degree where I couldn't run anymore? Did I go out too fast? Was it the downhills that were more problematic? What was it? What really caused that? Whereas with the flat stuff, it's almost always pacing. If
Mhm.
assuming nutrition and hydration were on point, it's like almost always pacing. So like the first step there was just kind of like diving into some of that and just saying, okay, where did I get a little too aggressive here to the degree where the wheels started getting a little wobbly at mile 80 and I was really fighting just to keep them on. Um, and I know I pinpointed some spots where it's like, okay, that was a little aggressive there. That was a little too fast for that spot in the race. I need to be a little more controlled there. So you start kind of applying that and giving yourself better bumpers in terms of like where you shouldn't go from a too fast or too slow standpoint. And just every experience that you have trying it, you sort of like narrow those bumpers into like what you actually think is sustainable for you. And then once you kind of have that, you're in a spot where if you just stick to the plan, it's probably going to work.
Yeah.
And that was kind of my experience with it, where when I ran my fastest 100 mile was I had sort of like closed those bumpers into a tight enough degree where I had a pretty small operating space, and I just knew I needed to sit there, and
Hmm.
it worked well. So yeah, I mean, I I probably spent a lot more time earlier in my ultra running career dialing in the nutrition side of things that was going to work for me because I do a lower carbohydrate diet, which is different than what most endurance
Hmm.
and ultra marathoners are going to do. Certainly, ones that are like running in the front of the sport. So it was sort of like there was some of that I had to really learn. Like, okay, where is the deviation here from what would just be a more typical like ketogenic or low carbohydrate diet for somebody who's just going about their day versus someone like myself who's training for ultra marathons and trying to break a world record and things like that. So kind of dialing that stuff in probably took about a year and a half to 2 years to really find the approach that I felt worked well for me. And I mean, other things too, it's like going into a lab and testing things, like actually figuring out like what are my fat oxidation rates? Where is my carb to fat metabolism at when I'm hitting the paces that I will be hitting on race day so that I just know ahead of time, all right, I need to input this much carbohydrate every hour in order to stay on top of that and then just drilling in a little bit more fine in terms of the body's needs versus just guessing at or not even guessing, even just using a population level data, which can be a starting point, but eventually I think you could probably need to usually dial in a little more specifically to you. So there's a lot of that side of things too.
Nice. Is there any races that you've done that or not? Let me say like this. So you do a lot of the track races as well as you've done some of the mountain races as well. Is there one that you prefer doing?
Um, the one course I really like that I haven't nailed yet that I would love to nail is like the Tunnel Hill 100 mile because it's basically like it was an old railroad bed. So
Hmm.
they took it and they tore up the railroad and they just put this like crushed limestone like path there. So it's
Hmm.
it's flat, it's fast. It's not quite as fast as like concrete would be or a track would be, but it's fast enough. And it's just straight shot running. You do an out and back one direction, and then you do an out and back in the other direction, and you do that twice for 100 miles. And the weather's almost always perfect there. It's in the fall. It's got like this enclosure of trees, this canopy of trees around it. So even if it's a little windy, you don't really notice that.
Hmm.
Uh, it's just like pure running, but it's almost like a little bit more scenic. It kind of feels like a trail, even though you're on like a crushed limestone path. And
Hmm.
like I really like that type of course. If I want to get into the trail side, like the real trail side of things, courses like the Javelina 100 are always interesting to me because it's real runnable trail, but they throw like an element of heat at you because it's in the desert and it can get up to the year I won it was like 102 degrees was the peak of the temp that year. So it's like you're dealing with something kind of like non-optimal that you have to try to manage and try to figure out. So I do kind of like that side of the sport, even though when I'm doing the track stuff, I dial it in and try to control variables. I find that if I want to make that sustainable or keep that sustainable, it's really useful to pull away from it from time to time and focus on a course like Javelina with something that's got like hurdles to get over versus just being kind of clean running.
Hmm.
Um, I do like the Western States 100, and part of that's probably because it's got a rich history and it was my first 100 miler and things like that. But that's kind of the most mountainous of courses that I really like to train up for. I'm not really into some of the real gnarly ones like Hard Rock and even UTMB to some degree.
Would you ever do, or have you done those races?
I've done Western States twice.
Hmm.
I haven't done Hard Rock or UTMB. And, at one point I thought like maybe I would do UTMB at some point just to kind of get the experience from it, but I think I'd probably do something different for an experience course than UTMB
Hmm.
at this point.
Okay. I love I like the history, like you said, of Western states. I love the fanfare of UTMB, because it is different than a lot of the ultras you see at least in the United States, where you don't have like fans, but
Sure. Yeah.
it is cool to see ultra running being like celebrated on like a mass scale there.
Yeah. And I mean they kind of pioneered the live stream
Hmm.
where they were the first ultra where you could just tune in and watch and they had like good commentary, good data feeds and stuff like that so you could really kind of like get invested in it as a fan. And now that that is getting way more available, you're seeing that a lot more races. So you're seeing a lot of races kind of get a lot more kind of commercial type viewership uh, opportunities where most of the big races now are live streamed and you can even some small ones are live streamed. So like I think that's one of the bigger growth points from a media side in the sport is our ability to access these things and kind of push them out to the people who want to follow them versus like when I first got into it, the only media you'd get at Western States would be I Run Far live tweeting it, where every aid station you'd get an update as to who was in the top 10, basically, and that was it. And people
Yeah.
loved it. People were just into it. It was like this you're sitting there just refreshing, waiting for the Twitter update to say who's seventh place at
Hmm.
in the women's field at Western States. Now you have cameras and video streams, and sometimes you even have someone following these runners on the trail, and you're getting like longer stretch shots of them actually out there, like executing their plan and stuff like that. So it's been kind of a cool few years to follow the sport.
Hmm. Um, when you think about, and you've been coaching now for almost 10 years, about?
Yeah, and I mean, it's ebbed and flowed a bit too, where I've always tried to be rational in terms of how much I take on. So since I guess I technically started coaching in 2013 is when I first took on some actual one-on-one clients. But it's gone from like a pretty big stable of clients to like just a few. And like when I started building out my podcast, I just let that kind of shrink down so I could have a little bit more time to focus
Hmm.
on getting that structured. Right now, the last few years, it's been a much bigger focus. So, I've got like 30 plus athletes on my roster and a
Okay.
group coaching team that I work with. Um, on that side of things now too. So, um, yeah, but it's always been there to some degree.
Nice. So, how much do you learn about running and body types and different people just from hearing how, like, a suggestion you give them or a strategy you give them affects them versus how it affects yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the argument for if you're going to be an effective coaching enough people so you get exposed to the variety that's out there so you don't get too
Hmm.
narrow-minded. Because, the coaching a lot of times can go in stages where at first you're like, oh, this worked for me, therefore it works for you. And you're just kind of just
Hmm.
applying what worked for you to other people, which if you're paying any attention, you learn really quickly that's not the case. So then you just start getting like exposure to different lifestyles and different or how people respond differently to things.
Hmm.
And the more people you coach, the wider that scope becomes of what you think is like on the table for optimization from one type of person to the next. I think somewhere around like maybe 20, maybe up to 30 people is probably something that's going to keep you pretty sharp because you're just going to get a lot of variety at that point.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, yeah. And some of it, I mean, I think what it is you do probably want to have some structure in terms of like on a philosophy. So thinking about things that apply to everybody and working within that structure is still good, I think. And then also having an idea of like, because like once you have that, then it's more about kind of we were talking about before, where it's like, well, okay, let's dive into this person's running history, their strengths and
Hmm.
weaknesses, their goal event, and what are the requirements there, and then start kind of poking at what we're going to change or do differently versus just saying, okay, here's the plan, start it here, and then let them kind of like run through it a bunch before you
Hmm.
actually start making changes. I think now we have enough data between like, different running like social media outlets, essentially like Strava, where you can really dive into
Hmm.
someone's running history and just talking to them. Conversation is probably the biggest like benefit from working with a coach because if someone I can get all the data in the world, but then talking to a person is going to really tell me about like what their actually experience on a specific type of run and allow me to pair that data with things that are going to be really important in terms of what they're going to be able to do on race day and what types of workouts we're going to want to prioritize in the short term and maybe build towards in the long term.
Do you only coach ultra athletes, or do you coach anybody outside of that space?
Yeah, I coach anything from, I mean, I've worked with people who've done 5Ks and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, I have some experience coaching shorter distance stuff when I was teaching too. So, I get a lot more interest from the ultra running world because of what I
Hmm.
do, but it's something where, I've also been on some really big podcasts and things like that. So then I get people who are just interested in running in general and they want to work with me. So I do have some clients that are focusing on like sub marathon distances and things like that.
Hmm. When you were this kind of slightly changing the subject, but you brought up like big podcasts. So you were on Rogan back in the day. Was it like a crazy effect after that of like just getting blown up by his followers?
Yeah, yeah, I definitely got a lot more attention after that. I went on in 2017, and that was kind of in the midst of me just really trying to fine tune my 100-mile runnable stuff. And then when I broke the world record in 112 hour at the time in 2019, I went back on, and that one was probably a much bigger exposure because
Hmm.
I was coming off a big wave from breaking that world record, because it stood for like I think it was almost 25 years or something like, or no, it wasn't that long. I think it was 2000 and it's like 17 years maybe, if I remember right. So it was something that had just kind of like been unbroken for quite a while. So the ultra running world and the road running world even started kind of diving in a little bit for a while there. So I sort of had like a big bump going into his show, which was a much larger bump on top of that,
Hmm.
that really kind of like threw my running career and coaching stuff kind of in front of a lot larger audience.
Yeah, I remember listening to that second one, um, and I was just like, "Oh my God, like that's insane!" Just hearing like the pace of the 100 miles, because I had just gotten into running maybe like a year before at that point, and because I didn't start running until like pretty much the end of my undergraduate, um, going into my master's program, and it really started when I was like March 2020 when the world shut down. I was like, well, let's just see how many miles I can do in a month because I
Yeah,
got nothing else going on, as I think a lot of people did.
the sport grew a lot during the pandemic. Running in
Yeah.
general did. Ultra running brought in a huge group of people that otherwise hadn't really engaged with the sport during that time too.
Hmm. And I remember, so I was living in Ohio at the time, and I was like, there's so many people using these these walking tracks now that weren't before. Because I had
Hmm.
started running before that, and I was like, this will just be a phase, kind of like January 1st of every year.
Yeah.
Everybody goes to the gym. Um, but I was amazed that like a lot of these people have continued to run and continued to do CrossFit or bodybuilding. You know, every sort of fitness has seemed to grow in the
Hmm.
last 5 years, which has been pretty cool. Sometimes it can be annoying if you're looking for equipment
Yeah.
at something,
Yeah.
but all in all, it's a good thing. Um, the one thing I wanted to ask was when you started exploring like the low carb um, diets and whatnot, what was the initial driver to try the diet that's so much different than what other athletes thrive on?
Yeah, I mean, there was some research that came out around the time that I switched from Dr. Finney and Dr. Volek that were kind of talking about the application of lower carbohydrate for even athletes. And that it sort of made sense to me to some degree for what I was doing since I'm racing at relatively low intensities. So, I wanted to kind of explore what that would do because I was living like what I would consider somewhat of an unsustainable lifestyle at the time, teaching, waking up at 4 in the morning, and just trying to manage energy through a variety of different environments and things like that. So I finished a race season and thought, okay, I knew like the number one rule was don't change your nutrition plan mid-season. That's usually
Hmm.
not unless you have like a really bad issue that you gotta, abandon what you're doing for. But I waited until the off season to really apply any of it. And then once I put it into practice, I started noticing some improvements in terms of how I kind of felt on longer, low intensity runs. And then I think I referenced this earlier in the episode too, where I probably spent about a year and a half to 2 years just really refining like
Hmm.
where the carbohydrate inputs would be most beneficial. Because I'm not like strict ketogenic or zero carb, so kind of figuring out like where that all fits and just learning how my body responded to those different things. But yeah, I mean, my body responded like quickly enough to it that I didn't get really too derailed. I had some things that I was like, okay, this doesn't feel quite optimal. So I'd make small tweaks that would usually work, and you make enough of those over a year and a half, 2 years, and you can refine a process pretty to a pretty good deal. And
Hmm.
um, yeah, and then it's just like watching workout data and things like that, and making sure that you're hitting the paces you're looking to be able to do, and uh, getting things done like metabolic cart testing to kind of see where things are shifting when you're doing different inputs. Uh, that kind of kept me motivated with it.
Do you do you find yourself to be very critical of like all aspects of your performance? And I ask that because, you're critical about the nutrition, the training programs, and like now I've seen you're doing like the reviews of new shoes.
Hmm.
Um, do you find yourself to be, like critically look at a lot of the different stuff you do?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I like data and I like kind of the assessment side of things. So I tend to sort of go that direction. I'll say this though, I think one thing is like you got to be careful with some of that too, because you can kind of over apply data
Hmm.
and then get yourself into a scenario where you're overthinking things that we just don't know enough about anyway. So it's like you can't apply such a rigid expectation or rigid rule to something that is so far from absolute. So I think like I like that side of things too. I sort of like the unknown, the curiosity, the like, oh, what if this happens or what if this changes type of thing to it. And to some degree, it's like at the end of the day, it's like you kind of got to go out and just like trust something that you're doing and see how it applies to like the uncontrollable aspects or the emotion, the art of running and racing
Hmm.
and the psychology of that sort of thing. So um I do like to kind of dive into that stuff, but I'm also aware that I think you got to be like at a certain point I got to just go out and run and see what I can do.
Yeah, yeah. Has it been fun to try out a lot of different shoes?
Yeah, yeah, it's been super exciting, especially now because I mean the running shoe world has changed so much since I got into running with some of the premium foams now, where, um, we have shoes now that are boasting like an efficiency return that is pretty high relative to what you're going to get from even pretty big training input changes and things like that. So being able to kind of test the entire market out, and eventually I'll be able to take them into a lab and test for efficiency stuff. So right now I'm trying to narrow down like a handful of shoes that I really feel are working well with me on race specific stuff. And then I'll take those ones in and find out which one stands out amongst that group and then probably race in that one. Yeah, so it's a fun like world to dive into and kind of experience for to some degree the first time. When I ran my fastest 100 miler, I wasn't wearing the premium foam shoes,
Hmm.
so it's also like okay, like I'll have a new experience on my next race because I'm gonna have a pair of shoes that at least in the lab suggests I'm gonna be more efficient in than whatever I would have raced in the past.
Yeah. So are you gonna like test a bunch and be like, okay, this is the winner and this is the one I'm gonna use for my next race?
Yeah, pretty much. I think what
Okay.
I'll do is I think there's a couple things to consider. One is like we're extrapolating out pretty far with some of these
Hmm.
efficiency tests. So, uh, like I mean, I'll do like a 10-minute stretch on a treadmill at goal race pace and test to see like where my oxygen consumption is at and where it decreases or raises based on the shoes I'm changing into. So, that's one aspect to consider. Um,
Hmm.
all things held equal, lower cost or better efficiency is going to move the needle the most, or move the needle more, the more efficient.
Hmm.
But like, there's other things to consider too. Like, I could have the most efficient shoe, but if it's super uncomfortable and it's not going to be working for me after say 30 miles, then it's a non-starter. So I'm gonna
Yeah.
try to find a few that are like that kind of check all the other boxes outside of the real strict efficiency data, and then from that group probably pick. So,
Cool.
yeah. So I mean, I'll take a shoe that's a little less efficient if I think it feels better on my foot, as long as it's not like a big. If it's a big difference, then I probably should just figure out how to make that shoe work. Like
Yeah,
to some
true.
degree, if it's got the potential for it, because sometimes it could just be like getting comfortable in the shoe versus from wearing it more versus whatever you'd
Hmm.
been wearing in the past.
And I've noticed are you mostly just doing road shoes?
Yeah, for now anyway. I think
Hmm.
once I get this thing going a little bit and have some reps in the tank from the podcast side of things and just some of the other social media review type stuff, then I'll start adding some more shoes to it, some trail shoes and things like that. So, yeah, right now I'm just trying to kind of get a full exposure to all the different brands so that I have the opportunity to test out some of the shoes. And by the end of the year, my hope would be to have all the contacts and all the connections so that I can start testing shoes before they release, so you can do all the work and then
Hmm.
release a podcast like around the time when a popular shoe is going to release. So when people are really interested in finding out more information,
Yeah.
I could have like maybe put 100 miles on the pair of shoes. That's like that. I think that um would be kind of a pretty cool setup.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, I know I scheduled it for like an hour and a half, and that means like we got like 15 minutes left. But I'm curious if what the journey of like having a podcast has been like for you.
Yeah, yeah. It's been awesome. I mean, I got into the podcast world super early.
Hmm.
When I first started running, I didn't think of ever being a host at first. I just got invited on a few shows. I was like, I really like this format. It's way more fun than, quick, short burst type commentary on social media for me. So I would basically go on whatever podcast would ask. And the podcasting network was so small back then. If you were going on like shows in any frequency, you sort of would just get invited on more. So just one of those things where the more you do, the more you get invited. And
Hmm.
eventually I got to a point where I got interested in kind of taking the other direction of it and hosting a podcast. So I, started a podcast of my own. I think it was in 2018 was the first episode. And that's been a blast. That's been such a fun kind of element to have embedded into kind of what I'm doing.
And I like your concept of like the outliers kind of mindset to it or the performance mindset to it. And it's is it cool to talk with people who are at like the pinnacle of whatever they're doing?
Yeah. Yeah, it is always fun to dive in with people in terms of different aspects of fitness and nutrition and I think it really kind of scratches like a little bit of a curiosity itch for me too, because I tend to be pretty curious about things. And, talking to people who've done something that is uh, really impressive, especially when I actually find the ones that deviate from what I'm able to do
Hmm.
more, almost a little more interesting. I've gotten more interested in talking to just like pro ultra runners too, but like at first it was more like I want to kind of understand where the similarities and differences are from someone doing something really really crazy but in a totally different element or a different world almost, so to speak. So um, yeah, but I've really let it kind of just be driven by my interests for the most part too. Like I don't know that
Hmm.
there's actually probably a good name for the podcast at this point because it's like it tends to go in like almost phases of like certain things that I'm really interested in at the time and then dive into that stuff maybe a little bit and then some spattering of guests that kind of pop up on my radar where you just like see something really interesting. You're like, oh man, I wonder if they'd come on, and you reach out and they say yes, and then you're gonna just do a deep dive with them
Hmm.
because of that particular thing that had just happened. So, yeah, I mean, but it's a fun world for sure.
I I feel like I can kind of sense that with like, so I listened to Tara, is it Tara Downer?
Dower, yeah, Dower.
Dower, yesterday. And I think you had like a similar track of thinking to like the way I like to do it. And I feel like I got the way I like to do it from listening to Jocko's podcast quite a bit. Like starting at the beginning of their life, like what drives them, and then move on to like how they became who they are. But like asking about early childhood with her and whatnot, and what got her to becoming the athlete she is now, was a fascinating conversation to listen to. But then the difference between that one and I can't remember his name, but his page is Wild Hunt Conditioning, I
Oh,
think,
yeah. Hmm.
and it's just very different type of podcast. But and he's still into athletics, and but from a whole different perspective. And
Yeah.
both were like fantastic episodes.
Yeah, there's different worlds that have sort of all gravitated towards ultra marathon running,
Hmm.
and it's like it ends up being kind of this like just like group of people that all have kind of some similarities, but also some really big differences in terms of what
Hmm.
their interests and pursuits are. But the cool thing about ultra running is like you do something like say 100 miler, you get a good experience of what it is, and now you have like this point of connection amongst like the other ultra runners, whether they are someone like James Pyrat or someone like Tara Dower, who are kind of doing it for different reasons, but
Hmm.
can relate to like the experience of well, Tara on the Appalachian Trail, probably massive sleep deprivation, and then James same thing for some of this. He's at like a 500-mile trek and kind of navigating those same kind of uncertainties and kind of ups and downs over the course of it all.
Yeah. Um, I would love to hear an episode, and maybe I missed it, but I'd love to hear an episode with like you and Killian. Um, with like the night or the is it 82 peaks in
Oh
19
yeah.
days. Just a fascinating like ultra um type event or excursion, expedition might even be a better word to say for something like
Yeah.
that. But it'd be very fascinating. But oh, that is another question I wanted to ask you, but I'm blanking on it right now. Um, is there things that like you're currently still chasing, and that you want to go after in the athletic world?
Yeah, I think I still have my fastest 100 mile. Uh, at least I've got a few more years maybe to really take a swing at that.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my goals the next 3 years is just to take a few swings at that. Especially now with the shoe stuff too,
Mm-hmm.
where I feel like I'm a little bit on more level playing field than I have been the last few years with access to some of the more premium foams.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so yeah, I think trying to PR in the 100 mile is a really kind of the biggest like front and center athletic goal of mine right now. I think if I continue, I try not to think too far ahead in terms of like holding myself to some sort of standard to like be an ultra marathon runner for the rest of my life versus engaging with the sport in a different way, or just moving on to something different. But uh, I do think that there'll be a point where I'm done with the 100 mile, at least from a like I'm gonna try to run faster than I ever have before, and maybe test some stuff in like more multi-day type things, or what they call like fastest known times, or FKTs, where you run
Yeah.
like a specific route and things like that. Um, at this point, I'm interested in that stuff to the degree where like I think if I start refocusing my training and stuff on that, and then do a few of them, I could easily get hooked and then spend a few years kind of chasing some of those sort of things.
Um, I just saw on a social media post, and it was Matt Johnson. Uh, and it sounds like you two just did a podcast. Um, what was it like, like coaching him to do the run across Texas?
Yeah, so I didn't actually coach Matt for that. I started
Oh,
working with
okay.
him right after that. So he's training for the Leadville 100 right now, and that's what
Yeah.
we're working towards, is getting him set for that. And Matt's great. I love working with guys like Matt because he has a very clear blueprint in terms of like what he's been doing from a training standpoint over the last couple of
Hmm.
years. And he's got like this massive foundation, and when I can get someone who's got a massive foundation like he does, then it's a lot of fun to kind of input some things that are a little more specific. um Matt's the kind of guy who kind of just flies by the seat of his pants, so you add a little bit of structure in the right spots for someone like that,
Hmm.
and they take off pretty quick. So I'm excited to see what he can do with a speed work development phase on top of that aerobic base that he's built over the last couple of years.
Cool. Cool. Um, and then the last question would be, so Courtney has her pain cave in when she gets deep into an ultra, uh, according to Walter. Do you have anything similar to that when you're deep into a race?
Yeah, I mean, I start kind of thinking about that stuff in training where like there'll be spots where you hit failure points in races where they maybe don't show up on paper super clear all the time. Sometimes they show up very clear, but where you just sort of hit a spot where you can't quite persevere to the degree you'd like to, and your
Hmm.
pace falls off. In worst case scenario, you drop out, but oftentimes you still finish and you just run a lot slower at the end.
Yeah,
So I look at it kind of through the lens of like, okay, like there's these different spots that I'm going to hit those challenge points. And I like to kind of visualize those in training. So, like, if I'm doing a run like I did this morning where I'm out on the track and I'm going to, cover a fifth of what I would do for a 100 miler, I try to put myself in the mindset of like, okay, you're at 80 miles of the 100-mile race here and you're just trying to stay on pace. Like, visualize what it's like to kind of hit a low
mm-hmm.
and like redirect and just work on kind of the conversation that you're going to have with yourself when you hit those spots, so that when you get there in race day, it's not like, okay, I got to figure out what to do here mentally. It's like you already know, you've already done it a bunch of times, you've done all these dress rehearsals, and your thought process kind of gravitates towards those versus trying to figure something out on the fly.
Gotcha. Okay. Is there any last question I'll ask it? Any tips you have for running in heat, like plus 100 degrees?
Yeah. Um, I mean, prepping for it's huge because you can get some pretty good adaptations. So something as
Hmm.
simple as getting into the sauna 3 times a week for 20 minutes after a training session for like 3 or 4 weeks prior to the event will go a long way. If you're already training in the heat, you probably will already have those adaptations. But if not, that will help a lot. Especially so if you're someone training in the winter and then you're getting to a warmer race or something like that, that could be a really powerful tool.
Hey, sorry about that. My computer died.
Oh, okay. I figure it was
Hopefully
on
I
my
can.
end.
No, it was mine. I didn't realize I didn't have my charger with me, so um,
Gotcha.
I think I can probably finish up on here if it sounds okay.
It does. It sounds totally fine. Um, Basically, what I was getting at was I was just wanting to say thank you for coming on. And I don't have a huge following by any means, but if you want to just kind of tell people how they can find you and anything you want the people to know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll add because I think I dropped off right before I was answering the full question of your heat adaptation thing.
Oh yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
I'll add one more thing to that, other than the pre-prep stuff, is topical cooling is great. Like if you think of just the way, especially if it's dry heat, like your
Hmm.
body cools by actually the sweat evaporating, and that sweat pulls the heat with it. So when you start overheating in the heat, it's basically you just can't produce as much sweat. So you pour water on yourself and create that same effect of that evaporating
Mm.
off, and that pulls some of that heat off of your body. So topical cooling can go a long way on race day as well. Yeah, and then in terms of where people can find me, easiest spot to find everything is just my website at zachbitter.com. There you can link to my podcast, coaching, social channels. I'm probably most active on Instagram and X. Instagram is at ZachBitter and X is at ZBitter.
Okay. I tried that the cool water cooling this
Yeah,
summer at an ultra race that um I've done 3 times now, but like a bucket hat full of ice and just cinch it onto my head and it
yeah,
slowly drips over you.
uh-huh.
Um, at that point, I was moving pretty slow, so it didn't fall out well, like running too fast, but it was pretty great when the water would drip down on you. It's like it was
Yeah,
raining cool water. Um,
no
but
doubt.
yeah, I appreciate it, Zach. It was great to get to know you a little bit here, and all right, everybody. Um, that was one of my favorite podcasts to host yet, and obviously I was fanboying the whole time. But I promised I'd tell the story that I forgot to tell him, and that was 2 nights ago. I was prepping for the podcast, and I was like creeping on Zach's Instagram page to think of questions I can ask throughout. But that must have instilled into my brain because that night I had a dream that I was running an ultra in Arizona, and he happened to be there, and he learned it was my first one, and he's like, "Okay, I'll just stay on my heels, and you'll be fine." And so he just takes off at like a 6 minute pace, and I'm like, "Oh shit, okay, I'm trying, and I'm dying instantly." Um, and then he's gone over to this hill in the dream, and it's like super vivid. And so I get to the top of the hill where I last saw him, and I climb a tree, and I'm looking for him, can't find him. And then he just appears at the base of the tree. He's like, "What the hell are you doing? Let's go!" And so like, right again, I jump out of the tree, we start running, and we get to like a checkpoint in the ultra, and the lady's like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "I'm just following him." And she was like, "He's too fast." And I was like, "I know, but he told me to follow him, so I'm following him." And then I woke up, and that was the dream. But I thought it was funny, and I wanted to share that with you all here. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. Thank you all for tuning in. We got more coming out next week. Y'all, thank you so much. If you want to help support this podcast, reach out to me, send me people to come on the podcast, and ultimately um, support the endurance company. Reach out to me for information on our running supplement for an endurance formula. And beyond that, reach out to me about leadership and development events. Those are the 2 things we're hosting through the endurance company. Thank you all for listening.